Really, I'm going to talk about something called Stats19 data, which I presume some people are familiar with, but not everyone. So I'll first of all just say something about what it is, because it is a really useful data source for people who are not familiar with it. So Stats19 is police collision data. We've got police collision data going back online to 1979. In this talk, I'm using data from 2005 to 15. But it's basically a very useful resource. It's got collision level data, it's got vehicle level data, and it's got casualty level data all available online. A couple of things that aren't available online that I've also analysed are firstly something called contributory factors, which is what police officers think contributed to the incident in question, and also data on whether each incident involved a hit and run vehicle. So those two things are not publicly available, but everything else is, and it's really useful resource. It's got some shortcomings, which we maybe will discuss, but I'll just get straight on with telling you a bit more about it. It's been used in a whole load of news stories. People may have seen this lately. London roundabout named as UK's most dangerous junction for cyclists. That basically used Stats19 data. Quite simple analysis, just how many casualties occurred at different junctions. So that's one thing you can do with it, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that. One thing that I would say as a caveat is that one problem is that we don't necessarily know about exposure. So we know that a lot of cyclists were injured there, but potentially there may be a lot of other junctions that are just as dangerous but have fewer cyclists going through them. So this is a big caveat, and this is something that hopefully very soon I'll have some data to look at a bit better, but at the moment it's quite challenging. So I'm going to just give 3 examples of uses you can make of Stats19 data, and if people have got ideas or suggestions afterwards, I may not know the answer, but I might be able to go and have a look, or maybe you want to go and have a look because the data is out there, but maybe this might give you some ideas. So firstly, you can use Stats19 to look at changes in actual numbers of casualties, deaths, serious injuries, slight injuries. I would say that we record deaths very well. We generally have the right number of deaths. Serious injuries we record less well, and slight injuries even less well. So, you know, it's not everything, but it is pretty consistent from year to year. It's better than a lot of countries have got. So this is a fairly simple overall graph for Great Britain. This is casualty trends 2005 to 15 for different modes. So the orange line is cars, and all the other lines are various other modes, people using different modes. And the first thing you see is that because there's so many car user casualties, car or taxi user casualties, it's quite hard to see what's happening to all the other lines. And that's partly just because so much of distance travelled is by car and taxi. So to look at it a bit more, you need to sort of unpick and present it a bit differently. So my next graph is again for Britain. But here I've got deaths, and here I've normalised it to 2005. So basically, here you've got car and taxi users, here you've got pedestrians, and here you've got cyclists. And the number of deaths for all of them is normalised at 100 for 2005. Obviously, the numbers are quite different. So here you can see trend. You can see a trend for car deaths in cars going down, pedestrian deaths going down a bit, and cyclist deaths is actually kind of pretty stable. So that tells you something interesting. Obviously, there are changes in usage, but in terms of which type of casualties are reducing, you know, cyclist casualties are not reducing at the same rate as our other modes. This is London, and this is all casualties again, not only deaths, all casualties, and this is absolute numbers. In London, it makes more sense to use the absolute numbers on a graph because we have quite a lot of different mode use. So you can actually see what's going on in terms of the different users. So up here, we've got car and taxi occupants. The absolute numbers sort of going down a bit to 2013 and then up a little bit. Down here, we've got pedestrians in the blue, sort of slight decline. And at the bottom, cyclists in red, sort of slow increase. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about what's behind that in a minute, but that, again, that's kind of interesting, what's happening in terms of absolute numbers. This is Hackney, and this is casualty trends. Again, all casualties. At a borough level, looking at deaths or serious injuries, I don't think is that useful because the numbers are very small. On the top, we've got car and taxi users, the absolute numbers of casualty by year. You can see it goes down and then sort of goes up a little bit again after 2011. Blue is pedestrians, kind of pretty stable really after an initial drop. And red, we've got cyclists and kind of climbing up to 2012 and then a little bit of a dip. So again, say something more about this in terms of rates, but in 2012, cyclist casualties in terms of numbers in the borough outnumbered other modes, and then it kind of dropped a little bit. Right, so if we sort of park that there, and I'll come back in a minute to talking about risk, which is in terms of exposure, you know, how many people are cycling. Because if no one, and this was a mistake made by a former transport minister, right? The numbers of cyclist deaths we have in this country are lower than in the Netherlands. That doesn't mean this country is safer for cycling than the Netherlands, because you have to look at how many people are using the different modes. But I just wanted to digress for a minute and say something about using Stats19 to map collisions, because this is one of the most visual uses of Stats19. It's actually really easy if you can use something like QGIS, which is free geographical software. You just bung the data set, it's got latitude and longitudes, bung it into the software, and you come up with something like this. And hey presto, you've got lots of dots. This is cyclist casualties in our rough area. You can see there's Kingsland Road. And I want to caution a little bit about that, because it's very easy to do that, but what conclusions do you then draw from it? So if we zoom in, we can see, yeah, you'll recognise some of these roads. Again, cyclist casualties very much in London cluster on the A roads and the busy junctions, and that's what we can see happening all the way into central London. A bit closer again, and here's Kingsland Road again, here's Mare Street. I think this junction is around here, so clusters where we would expect to find them based on the patterns we see across London. And even closer in, you can kind of see all these overlapping incidents, injury incidents at the junctions, but also along the A roads mostly, but not only so. So this is quite interesting and shows you where they cluster, and is useful for saying, okay, this junction has a high number of casualties. But I think we do also need to look at what's behind that, and how many people, you know, how many people are actually using these different junctions, for instance, or what are some of the underlying commonalities, which is difficult, as I said, because we don't always have the data to do that. So one thing, I just wanted to give you a couple of examples of using Stats19 to look at incident characteristics before I finish off talking about risk. So Stats19 obviously has data for all these different roads. It's actually hard to look at individual roads, because even ones with a lot of incidents, you have relatively low numbers overall in any one stretch of road. So one useful thing you can do with the data is say, okay, what's common to these types of road? What common factors can we draw from this whole data set? So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of this. You may well have other ideas for analysis that we could do. So this is just something that I looked at for pedestrians. So what proportion of pedestrian injuries happen at or near major junctions, A road junctions? So this is urban areas outside London, and this is London. And it's quite interesting that urban areas outside of London, you've only got around 3% of pedestrian injuries and deaths happening at or near major junctions. But in London, it's around 14%. Now, that graph doesn't tell us why that is. It could be there's more major junctions, there's more pedestrians in those places, but it tells you, you know, if you want to look at casualty reduction, this maybe gives you some ideas of where it's particularly problematic. If we look at cyclist injuries, then it really stands out even more. So comparing urban areas outside of London, cyclist injuries 5% at major junctions, 7% of deaths are at major junctions. But in London, we've got 15% of cyclist injuries at these junctions and 27% of deaths. So that is really interesting, and is really quite a difference with other urban areas, and the stuff there to do with HGVs, for instance, I would expect. Hit and runs, I've promised hit and runs, so this is something from the hit and run data set, which isn't publicly available, but DFT will provide. And this I found interesting in relation to the borough, and quite shocking. So across Britain, for all collisions, around 1 in 10 involve a hit and run vehicle, 11%. Across London, just over 15% of collisions involve a recorded hit and run vehicle. In Hackney, it's 20%. So even within London, relatively high proportions of incidents are hit and runs. And I think if we think about the experience for people of being involved in a collision, but if it's a hit and run on top of that, and somebody has literally just driven away after they've left you in the road, then there's some quite worrying implications, and also in terms of clearing up, you know, identifying the perpetrator and so on. And where cyclists or pedestrians are injured, that rate is higher as well. So from a vulnerable road user perspective, it's worrying that, you know, nearly 1 in 4 incidents where a cyclist is injured, then there is a hit and run vehicle also involved in our borough. Again, I don't have any definite reasons why this is the case, but it's quite concerning looking at the data. Finally, I wanted to say something about risk comparisons, and this is, I think, really important in terms of not just the numbers, but the risk. You know, if you go out and cycle for an hour, if you walk 3 miles, what is the risk? And often we don't have that data. We don't have great data on walking and cycling. But there's some stuff that we can do, and I wanted to give you just a few examples of how you could compare risk before I finish, hopefully by 8 o'clock. So this is just a graph that I produced comparing cyclist deaths in Copenhagen and in London. And the reason why I did this is there's roughly similar amounts of cycling in London and Copenhagen. Even though London's got a lot more people, Copenhagen's got a lot more cycling, it kind of balances off. So you can see London is, at the moment, we're having between 12 and 15 deaths. It was lower in 2015, then went up again a bit. Copenhagen has now got to a point where it's having sort of 2 or 3 deaths. So that's kind of one way of comparing rates and how safe it might be in our city compared to other cities. It's not really worth comparing injuries because the recording is so different, but deaths are reliable. Now I wanted to just say something about how cycling risk had changed in London over this 11-year period. So this is journey stages made by Bike in London. So this is a measure of the amount of cycling. So this is important for thinking about risk. So the amount of cycling in London is going up. It's not going up really dramatically, but it's going up. But on this slide, what I've done here is I've calculated cycle injuries per million journey stages. So the blue bar is a measure of how risky it is to cycle in London in terms of the injuries per distance, per journeys that people are making. And you can see that as the amount of cycling is increasing, shown on the orange bars, the risk seems to be, to some extent, going up as well. It doesn't seem to be a clear picture of safety in numbers. If we were seeing a strong safety in numbers effect, we'd see the orange bars go up, the amount of cycling going up, and the risk of cycling going down, and we don't seem to be seeing that, which I find worrying. I mean, the data's not amazing, but you can't see a clear, in Copenhagen you could see a clear effect, and here you can't. Just something quickly in terms of comparing boroughs. So I did a comparison. The details are on my website. I wrote a little article about it, but I did a comparison of risk per borough just for 1 year, and the line is the average for London. And if we remember that the average for London is not amazing, I just showed the comparison with Copenhagen, and Hackney is here slightly better than average, and all the inner London boroughs are sort of clustering around the average. But some of the risks in outer London boroughs are quite startling. And the reason why they don't get so much attention is you don't have the volume of cycling. Central London has Central London has some horrible junctions, and it has a lot of cycling injuries at those junctions, and the sheer numbers gets them attention. But Harrow, I calculated, that really cycling in Harrow might be 4 or 5 times as risky as cycling in some of those places, but because so few people cycle, you don't see the injuries and the deaths. You don't actually get that focus on them, which is why I think thinking about risk is really important, as well as thinking about actual injuries. I am finishing now. This is Jono reminded me I should read the Hackney Road Safety Strategy again to see what if there's anything I wanted to put in about it, and I found something really interesting. So one of the actions on the council from about 16 months ago was to develop and adopt a rate-based means of monitoring cyclist casualties. So just what I've been talking about, not just the numbers, but what is the actual risk like? How is it changing? Because we know cycling's gone up in Hackney. And so I did one for them. It's a bit back of the envelope this afternoon. So this is the number of cyclists injured in our borough. So this is just the absolute number from 2005 to 2015. So it's going up to 2012, quite a lot, and then sort of basically fairly similar after that. Now we know cycling's gone up in Hackney over that period. But are we seeing safety in numbers? Has cycling got safer even though the absolute numbers have gone up? So I developed a sort of simple rate-based measure. The Department for Transport counts cyclists and all other vehicles on various count sites every year. Now this is only about 60 count sites, mostly on major roads, but not exclusively. So I averaged out those counts per year. And you can see that counts, this is to 2005. From 2005, it's sort of going up a bit. There's a bit of a curve, but then it goes up. So I'm using that data to derive a measure of risk. The fact that we know roughly how many cyclists there are each year from that data, and we also know the number of casualties. And this is what I got in terms of the risk changing. So this is 2005, and we can see the risk per cycle flow unit or whatever. You know, it's not a clear measure, but it's a measure of how risky it is for each cyclist. Sort of going up there to 2012, and then starting to drop off by 2015, but still above the 2005 level. So I thought, you know, this is not an exact figure. This is a bit of a guesstimate, but again, it's not showing a sort of clear safety in numbers effect, which I find worrying.
Hackney.
That is just Hackney, yes. Sorry.
So it's gone up and then the risk has come down.
Yes. So there. It's kind of going up, and then it's come down again. Yes. So during this period, cycling is going up, but so are injuries. So this is some kind of way of unpicking possibly what's happening. Really, the Stats19 data is an incredible resource, but it also shows some quite worrying things for our borough, I think, in terms of the safety in numbers, the injuries increasing, and in terms of some of the stuff around hit and runs as well. So I guess I'll just leave it there. If there's...
Did you have any data? Sorry, very quickly. Did you have any data on hit and run numbers? Is that?
Hit and run numbers have been going up, and they've been going up as a proportion of all incidents recently as well in the borough. So it seems to be a growing problem numerically, but also as a proportion of incidents too.